Well, good afternoon, and welcome to our 5th annual Symposium on the Nobel Prizes. I want to thank you all for coming and welcome you. I'm Doug Doran. I'm an Associate Dean in the College of Arts and Sciences, and I was the person who was responsible for organizing this event. It's always a little bit stressful waking up at 6 in the morning during the week the Nobel Prizes are announced, hearing who the winners are, and then trying to identify the person or people on our faculty who would be best able to give a talk about that year's Nobel Prize. Remarkably enough, in spite of the anticipation that this is going to be a difficult problem, almost always it turns out to be easy. Our faculty are working on topics that are close enough to the things that the Nobel Prize winners are doing that we can usually identify somebody who is actually intimately familiar with their work. This is, on the one hand, a testament to the importance of the work that the Nobel Prize recognizes, and on the other hand, I think it indicates something about the breadth of our faculty and how well we are choosing faculty that they are working on topics of such current importance. I would note, in fact, that 2 of the speakers in this year's symposium are brand new assistant professors whose work is very closely aligned with the work of this year's Nobel Prize. A remarkable coincidence, and I guess you could ask what we would have done had they been hired a semester later. It would have been a little bit more difficult to find the appropriate speakers. If you came to last week's talk, you heard George Watson, Dean of the College, say a few words about the nature of the Nobel Prizes and the fact that they don't always recognize everyone who has been responsible for the work that's being recognized. During the week that the Nobel Prizes were announced, I got an email from an organization known as the Rosalind Franklin Society that had some other comments on this. For those of you who don't know or don't recall, Rosalind Franklin was responsible for helping to solve the structure of DNA. She was the X-ray crystallographer who collected the data for which Watson and Crick won a Nobel Prize. She was not recognized for her work during her lifetime, or indeed for many years afterwards, and it only came out somewhat later just how important her contributions were. And of course, this is well known now, and her work is highlighted in textbooks. This is in some ways emblematic of a broader issue among the Nobel Prizes, in that very few women have actually been recognized for their work. And this is the reason for the organization of the Rosalind Franklin Society and why they sent out these emails during the week the Nobel Prizes were awarded. They pointed out that since the awards began in 1901, a total of 310 awards have been made in the sciences. 551 individuals have been recognized as laureates, and out of that 551, only 16 were women, 2 in physics, 4 in chemistry, and 10 in physiology or medicine. The effect isn't actually limited to the sciences. The Economics Prize was first awarded in 1968, but only 1 woman has been recognized as a laureate, and that was in 2009 when Elinor Ostrom was given the Nobel. Literature and Peace Prizes have been made more frequently to women. 12 literature laureates have been women out of 104 total, so still not a remarkable percentage. And 15 peace laureates, including the 3 this year, have been awarded out of a total of 92. Coincidentally, this week I got another email from the Association for Women in Science, which reported a new study that they had done on awards given by professional societies in the sciences over the last decade. They found that women were much more likely to win service awards than they were to win awards for their research. In one case, for one particular society, women received over 40% of the service awards and less than 10% of the research awards. So in other words, these are women who have been around in the profession long enough and are prominent enough to be recognized for their service work, and yet they are not being recognized for their research. These patterns are in some ways consistent with our stereotypes about the relative roles of men and women, and maybe particularly in the sciences, but it seems to hold true as well in other fields. And the data on both Nobel Prizes and these other awards for professional societies don't show any indication that this is really changing over the last decade or two. So this may reflect social factors or unconscious bias. It's hard to say. The evidence is that both men and women are subject to unconscious bias. So it's not that we can actually point to a powerful cadre of people that are enforcing this. But it is true that we need to consciously guard against such kinds of biases, and I think self-awareness is the best remedy. So while I have you here, there's many faculty members, many prominent faculty members in this room, let me just say, please keep this in mind when you have the opportunity to nominate your colleagues for awards. And go out of your way to assess the contributions of women and any other groups that, members of groups who may be under-recognized by awards in your own field. I'm pleased that out of the 6 speakers for this year's symposium, 4 of them are women, including 2 brand new assistant professors, as I mentioned. This wasn't planned. We didn't go out of our way to do this. We simply picked the people who were best qualified to give the talks. I'm really pleased that it turned out that way. And I hope that among this group there are some future prize winners as well. With that, I want to introduce the first speaker who will talk about the Peace Prize. Kara Ellerby is one of our brand new assistant professors. She earned her PhD in July of 2011 at University of Arizona. Her field was international relations and comparative politics. She currently is an assistant professor in our political science and international relations department and has a joint appointment in women's studies. Her research interests include women, gender and security, women in peace agreements, women in post-conflict, and gender norms. This year she's teaching courses in gender and politics, an introduction to international relations, and feminist international relations theory. She's also taught African government and politics. And she served as a Peace Corps volunteer in Mozambique from 2004 to 2006. She is very familiar with the subject of this year's Nobel Peace Prize, and we're very pleased to have her. Please join me in welcoming Kara Ellerby.
In the prologue to her memoir, titled Mighty Be Our Powers, Lola Bowe writes, "Modern war stories often resemble each other, not because the circumstances are alike, but because they're told the same way. Commanders are quoted offering confident predictions of victory. Male diplomats make serious pronouncements. And the fighters, always men, whether they are government soldiers or rebels, whether they are portrayed as heroes or thugs, brag, threaten, brandish grisly trophies, and shoot off their mouths and their weapons. It was this way in my country, Liberia. During the years that civil war tore us apart, foreign reporters often came to document the nightmare. Read the accounts. Watch the video clips. They are all about the power of destruction. Bare-chested boys on foot or in pickup trucks fire enormous machine guns, dance crazily in wrecked city streets, or crowd around a corpse, holding up a victim's bleeding heart. A young man in sunglasses and red beret regards the camera coolly. We kill you, we will eat you. Now watch the reports again, but look more carefully at the background, for that is where you will find the women. You'll see us fleeing, weeping, kneeling before our children's graves. In their traditional telling of war stories, women are always in the background. Our suffering is just a sidebar to the main tale. When we're included, it's for human interest. If we are African, we are even more likely to be marginalized and painted solely as pathetic. Hopeless expressions, torn clothes, sagging breasts. Victims. That is the image of us the world is used to, and the image sells. Once a foreign journalist asked me, "Were you raped during the Liberian War?" When I said no, I was no longer of any interest. During the war in Liberia, almost no one reported the other reality of women's lives. How we hid our husbands and sons from soldiers looking to recruit and kill them. How, in the midst of chaos, we walked miles in search of food and water for our families. How we kept life going so that there would be something left to build on when peace returned. And how we created strength in sisterhood and spoke out for peace on behalf of all Liberians. This is not a traditional war story. It is about an army of women in white standing up when no one else would, unafraid because the worst things imaginable have already happened to us. It is about how we found the moral clarity, persistence, and bravery to raise our voices against war and restore sanity to our land. You have not heard it before because it is an African woman's story, and our stories are rarely told. I want you to hear mine. Today, I will attempt to facilitate a retelling of this often one-sided story of war and peace. It is a story about promoting sisterhood, challenging victimhood, and launching a proactive peace. This year's Nobel Peace Prize was awarded to 3 women, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, Lola Bowe, and Tuakul Carmen, for, and I quote, their nonviolent struggle for the safety of women and for women's rights to full participation in peace-building work. Before I weave the lives and work of these 3 women into a larger context of peace building, I would like to briefly introduce each woman and her direct involvement in peace movements. Perhaps the most well-known of the laureates is Ellen Sirleaf Johnson Sirleaf, sorry about that, who is currently the president of Liberia and the first woman elected head of state in Africa. She was elected president in 2005 after the end of Liberia's brutal 14-year civil war. She is a Harvard-educated economist, long active in her country's politics, who, while exiled, worked in various financial and development institutions, including Citibank, the World Bank, and the United Nations. Perhaps what she is less well known for is her work as a global peace activist. She co-authored a report for UNIFEM, the United Nations Development Fund for Women, in 2002. Titled Women, War, and Peace, the publication was an extensive field study of women in conflict and peace building. She spent 1 year traveling to 14 zones of conflict, including Bosnia, the DRC, Colombia, Israel, and Rwanda, to interview women involved in conflict. Today, it still stands as an essential guide and tool for understanding women in peace building. Indeed, it remains one of the most cited texts in the field of women, gender, and conflict. So even before her role in Liberia's own attempt at peace building and her tenure as president, Sirleaf Johnson has long been an advocate of peace, including her role as an investigator of the Rwandan genocide and commissioner of the Inter-Congolese Dialogue. Lola Bowe, also a Liberian, is a social worker turned peace activist who organized a multi-ethnic women's grassroots peace church movement integral to ending Liberia's civil war. She first began working through her church with UNICEF in trauma healing, which offered free counseling for women, child soldiers, and other victims of conflict. Through this work, she was invited to Ghana to participate in the inaugural meeting of the Women in Peacebuilding Network, which included women from 16 African nations. It was in this context of the Women's Network, which Bowe was named leader of the Liberia Women's Initiative to promote peace, which led to a coalition of Christian and Muslim women organizing prayer groups and protests in a prolific and powerful nonviolent peace movement. It culminated in a sit-in takeover of the hotel at which Liberian peace negotiations were occurring, forcing the hand of both parties, resulting in a signed peace agreement. Tuwako Carmen is the third recipient of the prize for her leadership in nonviolent protests currently taking place in Yemen. The first Arab woman and second youngest Peace Prize winner, Carmen has long been fighting for women's rights, human rights, and regime change in her home country. A journalist by trade, she founded Women Journalists Without Chains and has led weekly sit-ins to demand for greater freedoms of the press. She has organized hundreds of nonviolent protests to challenge President Ali Abdullah Saleh's corrupt regime. She has also challenged her own political party, Al-Islah, which is the Muslim Brotherhood in Yemen, when she disagreed with their policies towards women or their willingness to work with the president. She continues to express her demands for a national dialogue and pluralistic state. And most recently, she spoke at a protest at the United Nations, voicing her rejection of a current Gulf Council plan because it included amnesty for Saleh. She has vowed to remain in New York until President Saleh and Syria's President al-Assad are charged with war crimes. In her prologue, Bowe speaks of the power of sisterhood, which is an important part of today's women in peace-building story. One of the criticisms lodged against this year's Peace Prize was that it was awarded to 3 women, and that these women were all from developing nations, perhaps insinuating each woman's work alone was somehow unworthy of its own award. While there may be some tokenization in a singular nod to women as peacemakers, may I suggest a different way of thinking about this trifecta of strong, focused, and resilient women. Illustrative in Bowe's Army of Women Dressed in White and the Women in Peacebuilding Network, and Carmen and Sirleaf Johnson's participation in countless international conferences on women, war, and peace, it is also possible to interpret this Nobel Prize as an award to peacebuilding as an act of sisterhood. What I mean is these very women have not only fought for peace in their respective countries with their respective activists, but have utilized and depended upon a transnational network of women's grassroots, international, and national organizations to make peace happen. For these women, and many women working in peace movements, peace is more than a single agreement or one regime change. Peace is about changing and challenging any situation of oppression of women, whether it stems from the end of a gun or the beginning of a new nation. In the case of Liberia, the Liberian Women's Initiative depended on Ghanaian women for food and lodging. They depended on Norwegian women's organizations for t-shirts and fundraising. And this is how peace really works. Women activists call on other women to be part of their mission. The Arab Spring has depended on a strong network of sisterhood that sustains the practical and symbolic demands of protest. Women's peacebuilding is sisterhood in the sense that it is about sharing identities, strategies, and resources for a common cause, which has long been fundamental to women's frequently unnoticed participation and success as makers of peace. Bowe also writes of pervasive gendered victimhood in the traditional storytellings of war and peace. To be a woman, to be African or Arab, to be at war is to be a victim. But this rendering of women in conflict as victims both reifies and reinforces their need for protection while dismissing women's agency as complex actors and decision makers in war and peacetime. As she points out, it is not just governments or rebels who make women victims, but the Western media, who package women's war experiences into a very small box, highlighting their need for our help. This protection myth is pervasive and has long served to justify women's exclusion from formal peace building, which remains one of the most male-dominated arenas today. By 2009, women accounted for only 2.4% of signatories on peace agreements. Less than 10% of peace negotiators, and never had a woman been appointed as head negotiator. These women peace builders have not only worked to stop the fighting, but have also demanded more recognition of their long-standing agency and action. Let me explain. In the 1990s, civil wars accounted for 90% of the world's wars, which was a drastic change from the Cold War era. This increase in the number of civil wars meant a drastic increase in the number of civilian casualties. And early on, it was apparent that most of these casualties were women and children. Thus, the focus in the 1990s was on publicizing the disproportionate effects of war on women, including how rape was being used as an actual weapon and strategy of war. While recognizing that women were now disproportionately bearing the brunt of war, the rhetoric emphasized the need to protect women. This protector-protected dichotomy legitimated women's exclusion at the peace table, as it was believed or understood only the protectors could and would end the violence and the victimization. But a transnational sisterhood of women's peace organizations, who I call in my own work the Peace Women's Network, worked to pass a resolution in the United Nations Security Council in 2000 that confronted this binary approach to security by highlighting all the complex roles women play in war and peace. Women are soldiers, slaves, mothers, financiers, enablers, protectors, and many other things in time of conflict. And Resolution 1325 on women, peace, and security served as a moment of transition in which women demanded more recognition and more participation in peace building, insisting women are not helpless, pathetic victims in war. Rather, women are warriors and protectors also. Finally, Bowie's prologue speaks to the approaches women must take to both promote peace and women's rights. She writes about how Liberian women found the moral clarity, persistence, and bravery to raise our voices against war. Ultimately, transitions from conflict are about more than just implementing peace, as transitions can prove beneficial for the promotion of greater rights for women. As Tawakkul Carmen was recently quoted as saying, "This is not just a political revolution, this is a social revolution." In my work, I call women's peace building a proactive peace, because no one is going to ask for women's opinions or advice, or invite them to the peace table. Rather, women have to act strategically and vociferously to enact their social revolution. While warring parties in conflict may make certain demands, often the goal is to return to some sort of status quo. But for women, the status quo was neither enough before or after the conflict. Women's networks capitalize on these windows of opportunity peace transitions offer in order to alter the political, social, and economic organization of their own countries. Gender quotas in the legislature, gender-aware language in constitutions, new ministries for women, changes to property and family laws have all been important changes women have demanded from their new governments. Rwanda's parliament, which today includes 56% women, used post-conflict peace building as an opportunity to shape their country's future, arguing that since war is gendered, peace must also be gendered. For women making these gains, there is no turning back. The story of Rwandan women's representation is left out of traditional war and peace stories, but something from which the global North should be learning from the South. In my work, in which I have focused on trying to understand why some peace processes are more inclusive of women than others, I have found three important factors: the political space for civil society's participation, a clear women's agenda, and leadership who recognizes women's rights and demands as complementary rather than competing with their own agendas. When civil society can participate, women's groups can also participate. Often it is the women's groups who work across ethnic, religious, and political lines to develop a new vision for their nations. This also better enables women to actually have a list of demands which, in some cases like Guatemala and Darfur, end up in the peace agreements exactly as they were written by the women. And finally, leaders in peace building, either government, but usually rebel leaders, whether they are men or women, have to promote women's rights as part of their demands and vision. Otherwise, as in El Salvador, these issues can be put on the back burner until a later date. This proactive peace seems especially important in the context of the Arab Spring, and I believe it is something of which Tuwakul Carmen is well aware. As transitional regimes take their places, there is some evidence that women, who were essential to each country's protests, are now being asked to step aside. However, it is precisely at this moment in which women must organize as women to develop their own agenda and strategies to achieve it. Tuwakul Carmen, Lola Bowe, and Ellen Johnson Sirleaf are not only women worthy of a Peace Prize for the work they have done in their respective countries, but for their commitment to the cause of women's participation in peace more generally. While their story is not often told, the importance of promoting sisterhood, challenging victimhood, and engaging a proactive peace may serve as a reminder of what we lose as scholars, practitioners, and human beings when we do not hear these women's stories. Thank you.
Is there any questions for Carol? The photo that you have here of Carmen from Yemen shows her surrounded by a large crowd that appears to be entirely men. How unusual is her situation as a public figure?
Well, I actually think it's not as unusual as it's made out to seem in the Western media. She has been working since 2000 in protesting in her country. She's been imprisoned multiple times, and this happens in a lot of different places. The difference is that it doesn't usually get the same kind of media coverage, and often women's organizations can be usurped by other projects or political parties in order for them to kind of get on the bandwagon as, oh, look, we support women's rights also. So I actually think that, you know, we should probably give some of these places a lot more credit than we do, and having a great deal of respect for women as activists and in all the roles that they may choose.
Yes, sir. I'm always interested in whether you're surprised by the award. Were there others that you might have included with this group? What your reaction to that would have been?
The only thing that when I was working on this was how to connect Tuacu Carmen with what seemed to be a nod to Liberia, because Liberia had such a grassroots movement. But in some ways, I thought it was totally appropriate because, like I said, Carmen's probably the least well known among these activists, but has been working just as long in trying to meet the same kinds of requirements as other countries. So I guess I was pleasantly surprised that the Nobel Peace Prize went to women, because I feel like there's been a real stall in the movement. And what I'm noticing is 10 years after Resolution 1325, there hasn't been the significant impact that women peace builders would have hoped for. And that maybe this nod to the role that women play is going to kind of be the necessary step to really get this movement off and running the way it should be, because it's not institutionalized, right? Women still have to demand to be part of these processes. So I'm pleasantly surprised by it.
Okay, thank you very much, Kara.
Thank you.